Right now, Sri Lanka is having talks with the International Monetary Fund for the 17th time to secure a loan agreement, a bailout package in a bid to overcome the ongoing economic crisis. And the IMF team just concluded their in-person visit for bailout talks with Sri Lanka, reaffirming their commitment to help Sri Lanka in line with IMF policies, as they have stressed. Now, I've invited to our studios to discuss how Sri Lanka can possibly effectively implement a future IMF program. Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore and former member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and Director of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute, Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for having me on your show, Indivari.
We're just trying to understand now, for a long time Sri Lanka was talking about going to the IMF, and then there was a delay there, and finally we've had talks. This could be the 17th bailout package or a standby arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, if I'm not mistaken. How, in your view, should Sri Lanka work with the IMF going forward once the deal is struck?
So the only solution to Sri Lanka's deep economic crisis is an IMF program of something like $3 to $4 billion, probably implemented over 3 years. And this program will entail some tax rises, better tax administration, higher interest rates, higher utility prices, but the expenditure side is protected, so the welfare of the poor will be looked at carefully in this program, and then there will be strong anti-corruption measures. The world is really watching Sri Lanka very carefully and is also supportive. Now, the fly in the ointment for the program is that we have to complete some element of debt sustainability with our creditors. And this will involve quite complex negotiations with private creditors as well as China. And I think they will also be expecting us to have a political consensus in Sri Lanka that we want an IMF program and that we want to come out of this crisis in a sustainable and debt positive manner, that we are actually able to perform properly in the future.
Now, Dr. Ganesh Raja, we've been hearing the IMF saying that Sri Lanka's debt, there should be adequate assurances from the Sri Lankan side of sustainable debt to our creditors. What does this process entail? What would it look like? It looks like a cumbersome process for Sri Lanka. There's a lot of work needed, and we just heard of a tweet by the US Senate committee saying that any deal with Sri Lanka that the IMF enters should be contingent on certain critical reforms. How do you think we should take the first few steps towards this?
So the sad part is we delayed going to the IMF. All of last year we were talking about homegrown solutions which have sadly failed, and we lost critical time. What steps are involved now that we have appointed a law firm and a debt advisor is that they will have to conduct independent discussions with our creditors. And it is complicated because of the nature of creditors involved. Now, once some kind of deal has been struck with some of these creditors, we hope that the IMF board will then approve a program for Sri Lanka. What will happen in Sri Lanka was what they call a staff level agreement, hopefully, some progress towards this. And this will have to be formalized in a document and taken to the IMF board, and they will approve it. Now, we don't know how long this process will take. And in the interim, Sri Lanka will have to look for bridging finance to pay for essential fuel, food, medicine imports, as well as pay for other important items that we want to have the economy to perform well in the future.
In your expertise, how will the situation play out? We're seeing protests in Libya. We're seeing Pakistan falling into a crisis situation. In the United States and in the UK, we see soaring prices, inflation in record highs. And in Sri Lanka, of course, we saw the crisis months or maybe an year prior to other countries facing it. But how will this turn out to be, especially when we talk about a recession around the corner?
So the world economy is probably going to enter a recessionary phase. And this sort of makes life a bit harder for a country like Sri Lanka, because there are others indeed in need. Some 60% of low-income countries globally are facing risk of debt distress. And there are huge demands on a major investor in infrastructure such as China to forgive debt or to give moratoria. So we are entering this cycle a bit late. However, we are not out of the game in the sense that if we are able to conclude some discussion with our creditors and get an IMF program and build a political consensus in Sri Lanka, we, I think, have a sporting chance of success because of the geographical location of Sri Lanka in the middle of the Indian Ocean and a broadly market-oriented, business-friendly economy. But we'll have to do much, much better if we want to ensure success in the future.
You spoke about the geographic importance of the island nation, the strategic location. Again, we have superpowers involved in Sri Lanka helping us through this crisis. That again takes us back to the concerns we had previously about the kind of economic influence exerted by these countries and the influence on our sovereignty and integrity of the nation. As an expert and an economist, what and how do you look at this situation?
So Sri Lanka is now really at the bottom of the pail, and we have really dropped quite far. And we are in a development nightmare, the way I see it presently. So beggars can't be choosy, sadly, at this point, and we have to accept whatever help is available to us. India has stepped in as a first responder with $3.5 billion. There will be a price to pay, probably, in terms of providing market access to Sri Lankan production here, Indian investment coming in, and probably greater integration with India. China, if it forgives our debt, will also extract a price from us. So we're in a very difficult state. The recommendation I would give to government is that we pursue a strictly neutral foreign policy where we try to stress proposals on their merits, but with a view to bringing Sri Lanka out of this crisis. We have delayed, sadly, too long, and I think now it's time to get serious with an IMF program, a neutral foreign policy, and then a second generation of reforms to make this economy market-oriented so that we can provide the foundation for our children and our grandchildren so they can prosper and achieve the kind of future we want Sri Lanka to have.
Finally, the humanitarian aid that's flowing into the country, how do we ensure that these countries continue to support Sri Lanka throughout this difficult time?
So Sri Lanka needs to do two things to ensure that the humanitarian aid is well managed. The first is we have to ensure that this aid goes island-wide to all sections of the country and all sections of the population of the country. Secondly, we have to ensure that this aid is corruption-free and properly distributed and properly accounted for. The sad fact is if we do not do this, and we are being watched very, very carefully, people may not be that generous, and other countries may not be generous, and Sri Lankan people will be in a greater plight than we are today. So one would urge the politicians to be fully accountable for every dollar that comes in and make sure it goes to the suffering people. Right outside the studio, we have 3-mile-long petrol queues where drivers have been spending 3 nights there, and I talked to some of them recently, and there is immense frustration on the street, and my worry in this recovery scenario is that political discontent will play a great role. So one urges the government to take this whole seriously and move ahead with the right steps that we have just discussed.
Since you're here, I'd like to ask you one more question about the IMF. You've had experiences working with international agencies and the global financial lender's presence in Sri Lanka. Will there be any complications for Sri Lanka, especially when there are requirements that Sri Lanka should comply with? Will this be something that Sri Lanka could adhere to?
So I think we need to look at the conditions very carefully and develop internal mechanisms to try to implement these conditions. We don't want this program to be a failure. And one condition will be anti-corruption, which I think we'll have to look at very seriously. The other will be better tax administration. And as I said, this is a fairly mild IMF program, and I think it's up to us to try to implement it effectively.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and expertise here on AdaDerana English News.
My pleasure to be with you, Indira.
We had with us Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore and former member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Director of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute as well.